Hey everyone! Tonight we start with the secret world behind convent walls, where people taught piety and chastity but did not always live by them. The Middle Ages left behind beautiful cathedrals and holy writings, but they also left behind court documents, confessions, and letters that show a much less holy side of nuns, one that has secret lovers, concealed pregnancies, escape tunnels, and even full-blown orgies that are done in the name of spiritual joy. So, before you get too comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Please tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is for you. It is always interesting to see who is coming to see us from all around the world. Now, turn down the lights. You may turn on a fan to make that nice background noise, and let us take it easy on our trip tonight. A lady who joined a medieval monastery was supposed to leave the world behind. She gave up her right to any physical affection ever again, along with her clothing, jewels, and last name. In theory, she married Christ. In practice, the marriage was often up for debate. The promise of chastity was a big deal. No touching, no flirtation, and definitely no late-night meetings in the cloister garden with Brother Thomas from down the hill. But a smart historian or a bishop with a headache would remind you that vows are only as strong as the desire to keep them. And in a lot of convents, the will was open to change. Some nuns saw the vow of chastity as more of a suggestion than a rule. Things might get fuzzy after decades of being trapped inside stone walls with just other women and the odd gorgeous confessor. Very unclear. Some people got imaginative. There were quiet disputes that love did not count if it was not on purpose. Some people took advantage of spiritual gaps. If Christ was your heavenly husband, who could object to a little passion, whether it was real or not, especially if you wrote it down in Latin? Reports from church officials sent to check that everything was pure and pious typically feature delicately phrased accusations like inappropriate intimacy between sisters or unescorted male visitors to the orchard. Translated, someone was misbehaving, and it was probably happening around the apples. There were also convents that were more like dorms for nobles. Rich families would send their difficult daughters away with the explicit idea that someone else would deal with their excitement. Some convents attempted, while others just hoped the bishop would not come by too often. Not every nun, of course, went astray. A lot of them lived truly devoted lives, praying, learning, and making bread that could break a helmet. But some people, let us just say they thought the law of chastity was like how people today think of endless bread sticks. So sure, chastity was written down in writing, vowed to God, and sewn into the rule books. But sometimes things were changed behind those calm walls. Pregnancy is hard to explain away in general, and especially harder when you are a nun. You could hide a secret lover or sneak in a wheel of illegal cheese, but it was much difficult to hide a developing belly under a habit. It was also much harder to explain without getting at least one person. Numerous sins, and sometimes a confused donkey involved. Medieval convents were meant to be places where people could be chaste, but reality had different plans. Church archives, accusations from bishops, and legitimately scandalized abbesses all point to one fact: nuns were getting pregnant. Not in a hypothetical or symbolic way, but in a real, undeniable, and inconvenient way. The excuses were often very clever. Some others said they were possessed by demons. Some people said that miraculous conception was feasible because it had happened before in the Bible. However, when it happened 3 towns over and involved Brother Jacques, the choir director, it was met with doubt. One nun even said she fell on a male. It is hard to argue with gravity. When people found out about convents, they frequently panicked and forgot important things on purpose. The pregnant nun would go on a retreat or get sick all of a sudden and have to stay in bed for a long time. If she had the baby, it might be taken away in the middle of the night to a foundling home, a family who cared, or, in the worst circumstances, nowhere decent at all. Some babies were secretly buried on the grounds of the monastery, and the headstones seemed like vague apologies to God. The father was always the following inquiry, and the answers were different. Priests, nobles who travel, and gardeners. In one famous case, the defendant was a travelling musician with a harp and a smile that was not very nice. There was no need for any more explanation. Punishment was also not consistent. Nuns who were born into peasant families could be excommunicated and sent away in shame. On the other hand, sisters from noble families often got harsh warnings and a break. One abbess was very bold and had a lover and a child, yet she still kept her job. It is clear that management was different back then. Of course, the church said that these were unique, unusual, terrible, and extremely unfortunate events, but the historical paper trail reveals something else. Parchment does not lie, especially when it is full of controversy. The power of stationery was something that medieval convents could not understand. Love in the cloister was a delicate operation, done in secret, with code words, and in flowery Latin that could be a love confession or a very fervent prayer. Nuns may have promised to be quiet, but their quills did not always listen. Letters were the most important thing. When it was too dangerous to meet face to face and meaningful glances across the church were not satisfying. Love found a way through ink and wax. Some got through gaps in the wall of the cloister. Some were hidden in loaves of bread or given to people who seemed to be helpful but had great poker faces. Some of the things were sweet, while others were too rude to print. A nun wrote to the priest she loved that she wanted to drink from his cup of devotion. The bishop, who was looking into the issue, was so upset that he ordered the letter to be burned twice just to be safe. These covert love affairs were not usually short-term affairs. Some lasted for years. For more than 10 years, a nun in France wrote letters to a young nobleman. She outlived 2 abbesses and at least 3 failed attempts to catch her. She ultimately got exposed when she quoted Ovid too well in the choir book at the monastery. Of course, the church did not like this literary desire. Punishments came once letters were found: excommunication, penance, solitary prayer, or worse, being compelled to read the letters in front of the whole convent, which may have been more embarrassing than divine judgment. And if the lovers were priests, they were frequently given a job that was colder and less romantic. If they were lay people, one was once vergwoed, fined, and told to never talk to women of the cloth or any other kind. His answer: "Is it still possible for me to write?" It was much more uncomfortable when love letters were intercepted and shared like gossip columns from the Middle Ages. Picture spending hours writing down your most secret, holy feelings, just to have a grinning beginner read them aloud over me and cheese. But the ink kept flowing because love changed with metaphor, innuendo, and extremely determined handwriting when walls were high and eyes were watching. In theory, a convent was a place where people may be pure. It was more like a boarding school with fences and, in certain circumstances, a lot of ways to get out. Nuns in the Middle Ages were not only spiritually restless, some were creative in a physical way. And if you picture delicate women carefully walking through a rose garden gate, you're wrong. Some of these escape attempts included climbing walls with bed linens, bribing guards, slithering via underground drains, and in one case, dressing like a monk and going out the front door like it was a routine Tuesday. The reasons were different. Some ran away to be with their beloved again. Some people just did not like living in a monastery. Some others wanted to go home when they realised that eternal stillness meant just that, even at meals. Sister Benedetta of Verona may be the most famous person to have escaped. She was sent to the convent when she was 14 and she tried to escape 3 times. On her 3rd try, she pretended to be a novice from a nearby convent, made fake travel papers, and got away on a cart of vegetables. They say she made it halfway to Venice before they caught her, not because of her disguise, but because she kept trying to flirt with the guard. Some escapes were more exciting. After their abbess band music, a group of nuns in Saxony launched a mass escape. They beat the gatekeeper with a loaf of stale bread and ran into the woods. Later, church leaders said they were confused and not sorry, which sounds like the title of a great medieval drama. When detected, fleeing nuns were frequently brought back and made to feel ashamed in public, fast, and be kept in a chilly stone room with nothing but a crucifix and disappointment. Many repeat offenders were sent to tougher convents, where the food was worse and the walls were taller, but for some, even it was not enough to put out the fire of rebellion. Some nuns got away, married their boyfriends, and lived the rest of their lives claiming they had never seen a cloister, let alone lived in one. Because the habit did not always fit, and the window was open. Every controversy has its own famous person, and Sister Agnes of Würzburg should have her own stained glass window, ideally one that blushes. People say that Agnes was a smart and charming nun who was very good at music, prayer, and hosting a night in her cell for more than a year. Yes, a real knight, armour, a sword, and presumably a sad narrative about how they got there. It is strange that we do not know his name anymore, but we do know that he was said to be getting better from wounds he got in battle. It is not clear where this combat happened. It may have happened in a field, a pub, or maybe even the convent courtyard when he fell while trying to sneak in. The bishop's archives say that the knight was found after a novice heard weird clanking sounds originating from Agnes's cell. When church officials looked into the matter, they found the man hiding behind a tapestry, eating preserved figs and humming hymns to pass the time, his only way to defend himself. Sister Agnes can heal both the body and the soul. Agnes, to her credit, did not deny the affair. She really seemed upset that someone had interrupted her. She said she was taking care of the wounded, and that compassion is a sacred virtue. This is true, but it is not often used to explain living with a partner who wears chainmail. The scandal shook the convent, not just because of the affair, but also because it lasted so long. A few weeks, maybe even a covert meeting, is okay. But 12 months, during which the knight was seen at least twice wearing a borrowed monk's garb and helping with garden work, that required forethought and dedication. The consequences happened quickly and in a dramatic way. Agnes lost her job, was humiliated in front of everyone, and was given a new job with tougher rules. The knight was punished and exiled, although one document dryly observes that he did not seem sorry, which is probably the most medieval way of stating he smirked the whole time. Agnes later wrote letters to the church to complain about its hypocrisy, using quotes from the Bible and medical texts to back up her claims. One statement that impressed out was, "Had I let him die, I would still be a sinner." Not all seances in medieval convents were about sneaking knights or hidden letters. Some were louder, moaned, cried, and shook in front of everyone, all while saying they were in touch with God. The nun who is a mystic comes in. Some nuns in the Middle Ages were noted for having intense religious visions. These were not your normal quiet times to think. No, they were spiritual experiences that made people tremble on the floor with their eyes rolled back. Some church leaders proclaimed them sacred, but others had doubts. Why did these visions sound so excited most of the time? Sister Beatrix, a nun from the Low Countries, said that Christ appeared to her every night, not in a symbolic way, but in a real way. Her literature talked about how people could feel divine warmth and spiritual oneness beyond the curtain of flesh. She said she was married to the Lamb at one point, which might sound harmless until you read the portions where she said his presence was like fire that spread inside and outside. Not too obvious. Then there is Hadovich of Antwerp, a 13th century mystic whose poetry is like a torrid romance story from the Middle Ages, but it all takes place in a chapel. She wrote about love that consumed her and holy light that pierced her. Some of her statements were so clear that later church experts tried to change them into better analogies. But the original versions are still around and are really strange. Not every nun feigned their ecstasy. To be fair, a lot of them were honest. Medieval theology promoted profound emotional connections with Christ, occasionally approaching terminology that contemporary readers could categorize as PG-13. But being honest does not change the reality that these visions caused a lot of trouble, both spiritually and otherwise. Not everyone was impressed. Some bishops said these women were only trying to get attention. Some people were anxious about how these visions affected younger nuns who were more easily swayed. One archbishop, who was very skeptical, called them hysterics pretending to be holy. He was moved to a different job later, which may have been because he said what everyone else was thinking. Some mystic nuns, on the other hand, became famous. People wrote down, copied, and praised their visions. In medieval times, this meant they could write divine fan fiction and call it theology. Medieval monks were recognized for their ability to keep the body, the tongue, and especially the stomach under check. People thought fasting was holy, being hungry was a good thing. Desire is a temptation that is best left in the garden with the serpent. But in some convents, fasting was more of a suggestion for the day. After the bell stopped ringing and the abbess went to her room, another kind of ritual started the forbidden feast, People in convents were supposed to eat very little: porridge, bread, and fish every now and again, with an existential crisis for dessert. During Lent and the other dozens of fasting days that made up about half of the year, it was typically against the law to consume meat, rich cheeses, sweets, or drink wine. But let us be honest, no one can eat boiling cabbage forever without planning something. And they did scheme. Some nuns set up secret networks for cooking. Friendly merchants would bring salted meats to people who needed them for medicine. The wine was relabelled as holy vinegar. People who never came by somehow missed the honey cakes. One surviving convent inventory had 2 ducks, a whole ham, a jug of cherry wine, and 3 wheels of cheese. It was put in the catalogue as liturgical supplies. You can make your own decisions. People started having midnight feasts. Imagine this: a room in the monastery with candles lighted and nuns joking and whispering psalms while they ate roasted goose. One beginner is said to have burned her fingers trying to smuggle hot pastries out of the oven, and then tried to say it was a punishment from the Holy Spirit. No one bought it, but the pastries were said to be very good. These feasts sometimes turned into social events with men, merchants, priests, or even men who had no legitimate cause to be in a monastery after midnight. One monastery in Burgundy was found to be organising prohibited parties, which revealed out to be regular Saturday night meals with dancing, gambling, and what the bishop tactfully called inappropriate merriment. Not every nun, of course, took part. Many were truly religious and outraged by such excess, while others, well, let us just say their concept of fasting was eating hastily before someone catches us. A nun with a bump was one of the most disturbing things for church leaders in the Middle Ages, unless that bump turned into a baby, which subsequently transformed into a shallow burial under the convent pantry. One of the most disturbing scandals came from a 14th century French monastery, when people started to hear unusual noises emanating from the dungeon. There were not any rats, the plumbing was not awful. As one terrified beginner put it, it was something wailing that should not have been there. When church investigators got there, they thought they would find the typical things: a stash of alcohol, some cheese that was against the rules, and maybe a couple of love letters. They spotted a hastily dug patch of disturbed ground under a barrel of pickled cabbage. Underneath the body of a newborn baby, which was wrapped in what was clearly a torn wimple. The sister's headpiece. The hint was not subtle. The investigation that followed was as fragile as a plague cart. The mother was never officially named, but some nuns were moved soon after, which is a standard way of saying, "Please go away quietly before this becomes a trial," when asked. The abbess said they did not know anything. "I was not told about any births," she said, standing next to a wash basin that looked like it had been used a lot. She said that any lady who gave birth in the convent must have already been pregnant when she got there, which is one of the oldest and least convincing excuses in the scandal playbook. This was not just a one-time thing. In Europe, concealed pregnancies sometimes ended in tragedy. People left babies at the doors of monasteries. Some were taken out and given to relatives that were on their side. Sadly, a handful of them did not live long enough for either. The church reacted in its typical way with anger and selective memory loss. There were punishments that were both public and private, such penance and quiet transfers, but as long as the walls kept high and the letters stayed hidden, a lot of these stories were buried both literally and figuratively, every time a cellar was repaved or a pantry was reorganised. Though, there was still a chance of finding something new, a small controversy covered in linen and hush. Opening a brothel is somewhere between heresy and hurling a bishop out a window on a scale of things nuns should not do. But in 15th century Bologna, a former nun named Sister Clara declared she was done with vows, veils, and virtue, so she left the convent and created a very profitable brothel in the old convent structure, where the habits were still used, because it looks like subtlety was not in the plan. Clara was not really the kind of person who would fit in at a cloister. Church records say she was stubborn and often missed at vespers. In other words, she did not come to pray and might have had plans that involved wine and a guy named Marco. It was not very dramatic that she decided to quit the convent. She just went out and never came back. The real drama started later when people passing by, saw that the convent had suddenly become highly popular with guys who had never shown any interest in theology before. A local magistrate said that Clara Ara hired women, some of whom were former nuns and others who were just artistically unemployed, and ran the place like a military base. It was said that clients paid more for costumes. Some men wanted the complete confession experience, which brought up theological problems that no one was ready to answer. When the church heard about it, they panicked, not because prostitution was rare, it wasn't, but because this specific brothel looked like a convent and worked better than most monasteries. The view was horrible, Clara Ara, when summoned to explain herself, and simply shrugged and said, "At least no one here pretends to be chaste. She was excommunicated, then re-excommunicated just to be sure. The building was seized, the operation dismantled, and Clara Ara was allegedly sent to a nunnery far from Bologna, which seems like an odd choice, but perhaps poetic justice, yet her legacy lingered for years afterward. The site was colloquially known as the Cloister of Delight. It even appeared in bawdy plays and songs, and though the church tried to erase her memory, Clara Ara became something of a folk legend, the nun who skipped salvation and went into hospitality. Confession, the spiritual reset button of medieval Catholicism. For a nun, it was supposed to be a solemn ritual of self-examination, humility, and penitence. You knelt, you whispered your transgressions. The priest offered absolution. You left lighter in theory, but in practice. Confession occasionally led to more sins than it forgave. Enter the confessor scandal, a genre of misbehaviour so common it nearly became cliché. The setup was simple: one priest, many nuns, and an enclosed space designed specifically for private conversation about temptation. What could possibly go wrong? Quite a lot. It turns out, some confessors took their spiritual duties seriously. Others took ministering to the soul as an open invitation to explore the rest of the nun's emotional terrain, especially if she was young, anxious, or from a wealthy family whose influence might protect them both. Boundaries were porous, the curtains were thick, and ecclesiastical supervision was mostly theoretical. In one infamous case, Father Anselm of Tours heard the confessions of 30 nuns and somehow managed to develop special spiritual intimacy with 10 of them. The abbess began to suspect something when Sister Magdalene emerged from confession, giggling and smelling faintly of clove wine. Reports of impropriety trickled in across Europe. Some confessors were caught meeting nuns at odd hours. Others received love letters disguised as theological questions. One was discovered with his hand on a novice's knee, claiming he was checking her for signs of demonic possession, creative at least. The church's response: delicate thorns, followed by reassignment. A confessor accused of misconduct was usually sent to another diocese to reflect, which in medieval terms meant, do it somewhere else and try not to get caught this time. Meanwhile, the nuns were left in awkward positions. Some were shamed, others were blamed entirely, accused of seducing the priest with feminine charm, which in many cases meant existing while under 30. A few refused to confess again at all, choosing silence over sanctity. Of course, not every confession turned scandalous, but the setup, male authority, female submission, secret conversations, was practically an invitation to abuse, especially when wrapped in incense and Latin. Not all convent mischief involved flesh and desire. Some of it came in the form of suspiciously helpful nuns with access to plants that could either heal a headache or terminate a pregnancy. Nearly every convent had a herb garden. It was part of daily monastic life. Nuns made balms, tinctures, and herbal remedies for ailments ranging from stomach aches to demonic possession, though success with the latter was mixed. But in some communities, these humble healers turned into convent chemists, and the line between medicine and mischief began to blur. They were known as the apothecary sisters, and they understood their plants well too well in some cases. Many were trained in the use of abortive herbs like pennyroyal, tansy and rue, which were used discreetly to restore irregular cycles. Of course, the official explanation was always vague. The potion was for a nervous condition or a stubborn humoral imbalance, but everyone knew what it meant when a nun visited the herbarium after whispering with a red face and a shaky voice. Some convents became known quietly as safe places for women with delicate problems. A noble woman with an inconvenient pregnancy might suddenly decide to pursue spiritual retreat and emerge 2 months later looking oddly slimmer and far more devout. Sister Hildegard of Trier was particularly famous, described in records as a herbalist of great discretion. According to one very nervous male witness, her concoctions could calm a restless body, silence an inconvenient cough, or undo what the flesh hath done. You had to admire the poetic phrasing. Of course, the church did not officially approve, but as long as things stayed quiet, and the patients left looking grateful rather than pregnant, few bishops asked questions. It was easier to assume the sisters were simply very good at teas. That said, there were darker rumours, stories of potions slipped into wine or love spells crafted with hair and bone. Most were likely exaggerated. But some convents did face inquiries for harbouring witch-like tendencies, which in 15th century Europe was not the sort of review you wanted from your local inquisitor. For most medieval nuns, public exposure was a spiritual hazard, but for some became a legal necessity, especially when their private transgressions turned into public litigation. Across Europe, convents occasionally found themselves dragged into secular courts. The causes varied: inheritance disputes, doughy claims, property feuds, and more awkwardly, cases involving illicit affairs, pregnancies, and behaviour that was not befitting a bride of Christ. That last phrase appeared often. It was medieval legal code for someone's been up to something. One particularly spectacular case came from Florence, where a nun named Sister Constanza sued a priest for breach of promise. She alleged that he seduced her in the confessional, promised to leave the priesthood, and then tragically didn't. She provided letters, witnesses, a very pointed poem. The court was so flustered it delayed judgment for 3 years, hoping everyone involved would die or take vows of silence. Another case in Cologne saw an abbess accused of misusing convent funds to buy luxury linens, spiced wine, and gifts for visitors. The visitors, it turned out, were male, under 30, and unusually well-groomed for pilgrims. The trial records read like an expense report for a high-end inn. The abbess claimed the items were for spiritual hospitality. The court disagreed. Sometimes the church tried to keep things in-house. Canon law was supposed to handle naughty nuns, but when crimes spilled over into civil territory like theft, child abandonment, or contractual fraud, secular judges had to step in, and they were often unprepared for veiled women quoting scripture while denying everything with holy indignation. One nun in Burgundy was charged with attacking another nun over a man. During questioning, she claimed she had been possessed by jealousy and possibly by the devil, a 2-for-1 defence that brought her reduced penance and a relocation. These courtroom dramas were usually quieted as quickly as possible. The church didn't enjoy broadcasting its internal soap operas, but word always got out. Local taverns would buzz with phrases like, "Did you hear about the nun with the wine bill?" Or "She brought her doughy and her boyfriend to court." In a world where few could read and fewer could fact-check, relics were the medieval version of verified badges, and some convents collected them with all the restraint of a modern teenager at a clearance sale. Holy bones, scraps of cloth, drops of saintly blood. These items drew pilgrims' donations and prestige. For many nuns, relics were sacred connections to heaven. For others, they were more like revenue streams. Take Abbess Euphemia of Thuringia, who claimed her convent housed a piece of Mary Magdalene's hairbrush. Not a splinter of the true cross, not a veil fragment, but a grooming tool from the most misunderstood woman in Scripture. Euphemia described it as heaven-scented and encouraged visiting pilgrims to kneel before it and leave coins. The bishop, on inspection, discovered it was almost certainly a comb from a local merchant and smelled faintly of rosemary and goat. Then there's the convent in Bruges that proudly displayed the fingernail of St. Apollonia, patron saint of toothaches. When scholars examined it, they found it was in fact a sliver of cow horn. The abbess insisted the miracle came not from the relic itself, but from faith in its idea. A bold theological pivot, to say the least. Some nuns became quite creative. One claimed to have a handkerchief used by the Virgin Mary, still damp with tears centuries later. Another swore she owned a thorn from the crown of thorns, despite living in a convent located hundreds of miles from any known trade route. When asked how she acquired it, she simply smiled and said, "The Lord provides." To be fair, not all these relics were fakes. Some were genuinely ancient, mysterious, and possibly holy. But the sheer volume of relics claimed by convents, including 6 different skulls of John the Baptist and 3 navels of Christ, suggests that enthusiasm occasionally outpaced accuracy. Still, relics worked, pilgrims came, coins clinked, and convents that couldn't attract visitors with sermons found that bones, real or not, were excellent marketing. Behind the convent walls, it wasn't all rosaries and repentance. Some nuns were running soft power empires, conducting correspondence, managing land, and outmaneuvering bishops, all while pretending to care deeply about embroidery. These weren't your average sisters. They were abuses, often from noble families. And they understood something crucial about medieval life. Influence wasn't sinful, if you called it stewardship. Take Abbess Matilda of Essen, who effectively ran her abbey like a duchy. She negotiated land deals, hosted royal guests, and once publicly corrected a visiting count's Latin, she was revered as pious and terrifying, a combination that allowed her to get things done while technically never leaving the cloister. Many convents controlled vast estates. The church may have frowned on women wielding authority, but it had no problem accepting their taxes. That left abbessones and senior nuns in charge of finances, agriculture, and disputes with tenant farmers, and like any good landowner, they sometimes bribed local officials, forged a deed or two, and encouraged favourable tithes through blessings. One convent in Normandy famously negotiated its own treaty with a rival monastery after a dispute over fishing rights turned into a full-blown holy turf war. The abbess at the time, Sister Julianne, wrote a peace letter described by scholars as unusually sharp for a woman sworn to humility. Translation: she absolutely roasted the abbot in flawless Latin. Then there was the political matchmaking. Noble families frequently installed their daughters in convents, not always for piety, but for strategic placement. A nun from the right lineage could serve as a family agent, passing along information, lobbying quietly, or even delaying papal decisions with conveniently lost letters. Some convents had spies. Some had lawyers. One German-born abbey reportedly employed a scribe who also knew fencing, which suggests their copy-editing process was especially intense. Of course, the church noticed and occasionally tried to crack down, but as long as the sisters remained outwardly devout, there was little the hierarchy could do. You can't excommunicate someone for being too competent, even if they're clearly running the place like a velvet-gloved mafia. By the late Middle Ages, some convents had evolved into something resembling self-contained cities, complete with economies, hierarchies, gossip, secrets, and yes, the occasional underground baby swap. Not all scandal wore a sultry smile or left behind a pile of love letters. Some wore silence, not the holy kind, but the strategic kind. The kind of silence that kept reputations intact, that covered up the crying, the blood, the sudden illness. The nun who mysteriously vanished after taking ill, and whose cell was given to a new novice by morning. Because sometimes scandal wasn't loud, it was procedural. Take the case of Abbess Theodora, who ruled her convent like a medieval CEO. She managed lands, hosted dukes, and held prayer vigils so elaborate they required seating charts. When 3 of her novices turned up pregnant over the span of 1 year, she insisted it was the result of spiritual temptation and ordered stricter fasting for everyone but herself. When local clerics raised questions, she accused them of envy and threatened to withhold intercessory prayer for their souls, a chilling flex even for the 14th century. Other convents simply leaned into their notoriety. The Abbey of St. Lucilla outside Milan quietly gained a reputation as a refuge for reformed women, a vague term that meant former courtesans who now spend 20% of their day in prayer and 80% in expensive robes. They hosted musical recital, charged admission for feast day processions, and kept peacocks, actual live peacocks, in the garden. The bishop called them a minor concern. Rome called them profitable in England. One nun was so successful at forging indulgences that her scrolls made it all the way to York Cathedral, where they were blessed by a bishop before anyone realised they were printed using ink mixed with berry wine. Even the devout weren't immune to strange practices. One mystic nun claimed she had spiritual visions only when fasting and dancing at the same time. Her superior eventually banned both, prompting her to invent holy spinning. Visitors thought she was possessed. She insisted she was simply expressing divine joy at 30 revolutions per minute, because beneath the incense and scripture was always something else. Raw, stubborn life clawing its way through. The stone has cracks in it. Before he became the world's most famous philosopher who lived in a barrel, Diogenes was just the son of a banker in the Greek city of Sinope. Yes, the man who would eventually laugh at gold and spit on prosperity was born into money. And that did not last very long. Diogenes' life changed when he and his father Hesius were caught doing a very innovative crime defacing the local money. They were accused of actually messing with the coins, which might mean shaving them down or making fake ones. People still argue about whether Diogenes realised what he was doing or if he was just assisting his dad run the family business. But one thing is certain, the local authorities were not happy, so the future cynic was quickly sent away. For most individuals, being forced to leave their hometown would be a horrible thing. It was a job change for Diogenes. He ran away to Athens, the philosophical capital of the Greek world, and resolved that instead of going back to polite society, he would tear it down piece by piece with sarcasm, a sharp tongue, and no pants at all. At that time, Athens was home to many famous philosophers and well-spoken sophists, Plato, Aristotle, and everyone else. Diogenes, who had no money and was officially homeless, did not care. While others were talking about metaphysics in linen robes, he came to town with a dog-like smile and a purpose. He would expose every bit of hypocrisy he could find, and sure, dog-like is not a metaphor. He accepted it. He was delighted to call himself a cynic, which comes from the Greek word kynikos, which means like a dog, barking at corruption, biting at tradition, and licking the truth raw and unadulterated. His first order of business was to get rid of all the pretense in society. He gave up his belongings, made fun of manners, and slept in a big ceramic jar that people frequently call a barrel, like a philosophical raccoon. It was his last word. If society was a fake, he was going to live outside of it. This was not simply rebellion for the sake of rebellion. Diogenes thought that being virtuous meant living in harmony with nature, and nature did not need money, fame, or 10-room villas. It only needs to be honest and maybe a strong jar. Plato was the golden child of philosophical fame, and Athens was the core of it, polished, respected, and way too serious for Diogenes' taste. While Plato was putting virtues into groups and coming up with abstract ideas, Diogenes was actually and figuratively peeing on them. One of the most well-known stories about Plato is when he tried to characterize a person as a biped without feathers. He believed that was a smart way to sum up our species. Diogenes, who was always ready to use mocking as a weapon, plucked a chicken and brought it into the school, loudly saying, "Behold." Plato's human. The joke hit so hard that Plato had to change the description to include broad, flat nails. The man in the jar gets 1 point, but Diogenes was not only trying to get attention. He thought that philosophers like Plato had become too caught up in abstract nonsense and had forgotten how to live with integrity. Diogenes thought that virtue was not a topic for discussion. It was something to be experienced. And if that meant making fun of the smart people while eating onions and appearing like a homeless person, then be it. He often interrupted Plato's lectures by strolling through the crowds with a lamp in the middle of the day and mumbling that he was hunting for an honest guy. The crowd laughed uneasily because they knew he was right deep down. Athens, despite its marble structures and democratic ideals, had turned into a society where people told polite lies and acted like philosophers. Diogenes ripped it apart with brutal honesty. Plato is said to have told Diogenes that Socrates had gone crazy, and that was not completely wrong. Diogenes, like Socrates, asked questions that made people uncomfortable and did not follow the rules of society. Diogenes, on the other hand, did not want to talk to Socrates. He wanted a show. He was more than ready to act like a fool if it meant showing how hypocritical people are. He made the quiet existence seem crazy. He begged without any shame. He ate any leftovers he could find and went to the bathroom anywhere he wanted, which often scared people who saw him. But every deed, no matter how nasty, was a philosophical statement. Why should he be ashamed of doing things that are natural when others are not ashamed of lying, cheating, and hoarding money? Plato made perfect worlds. But Diogenes broke the illusions of this one, and he would say that made him the real philosopher, even if he did smell like old olives and fear of death. Diogenes had become a full-time philosophical threat by this point. He did not have a permanent abode, unless you include the huge ceramic jar he slept in, which was hidden away in the marketplace like a living street artwork. He did not have much, just a cloak, a stick, and a cup. But when he saw a youngster sipping water from his hands, he quickly tossed the cup aside. "A kid has beaten me at living simply." He replied that was the thing about Diogenes. He did not only talk about how easy things are, he made everyone else look dumb. He was not professing to hate money while secretly keeping silver under his mattress. No, he really did live on leftovers, bathe in rainwater, and sleep with the dogs. He sometimes called himself a dog, not to disparage himself, but to show pride. Dogs do not feel shame, pretend to be someone they are not, or care about their status, and that is how Diogenes wished to live, with the barking. Then there was the lamp or lantern, which he was known for carrying around during the day. "What are you up to?" People would ask. He would complain. "I am looking for an honest man." The subtext was very evident. Of course, he was not able to discover one. He did not even have hope. The joke was the point, a slap in the face to everyone who felt they were good while living lives full of compromises. Every move he made was a lesson, and his daily life became performance art. He was once caught masturbating in public and said, "It was easy to relieve hunger by rubbing my stomach." It was quite disrespectful. But for Diogenes, doing things that are natural was not bad. It was hypocrisy. And just to be clear, Diogenes was not impoverished because he had to be. Rich fans sent him food, housing, and even money to help him. He turned them down like someone who was trying to avoid a pyramid scheme. He thought that receiving charity meant being tied to duty, and Diogenes would not be tied down, nor by money, nor by manners, and definitely not by the way people coughed when he did anything rude in public. He was not living on the edge of civilization. He had put himself there like a thorn, sharp, painful, and impossible to miss. Diogenes was proudly showing off his dirt while everyone else was busy polishing their masks. That was the most daring thing to do in a world full of roles and rituals. The dirtiest man in Athens and the most powerful man on earth had one of the most famous meetings in ancient philosophy, and maybe even in all of history. Alexander the Great, a young conqueror with the ego of a god and a powerful army, came along. Alexander was interested in Diogenes after hearing stories about him. This man had nothing, wanted nothing, and was afraid of nothing. But he nevertheless got a lot of attention in Greece. Of course, Alexander had to meet him. He saw Diogenes lying in his jar, sunning like a stray cat that just happened to know a lot about moral philosophy. The king of Macedon came up to Diogenes and asked the famous question, "Is there anything I can do for you, Diogenes?" Without even sitting up, said, "Yes, get out of my sunlight." Meek drop. Alexander's entourage was frightened. This man had just told the ruler of most of the known world to go away like an obnoxious street vendor. But Alexander was impressed. He is believed to have turned to his warriors and stated, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." History teachers love to repeat this, and YouTube comments love to get it wrong. But no matter how true to history it is, the moment shows what Diogenes is all about. He was invincible in a world that cared only about power because he did not want anything. He did not have a palace, an army, or a good name to preserve. You cannot pay someone to sleep in a jar, you cannot blackmail a man who begs for food, and you cannot impress a guy who thinks luxury is funny. Diogenes taught Alexander and the world that real power comes from not requiring anything and not being afraid of anyone. That was the last thing Diogenes did to rebel. He was not shouting on the streets or breaking societal norms. He was just living life with the bare minimum and defying anyone to call him destitute. He turned one of history's greatest conquerors into a shadow that blocked the sun in just one sentence. Diogenes did not merely talk about this freedom like most philosophers do. He lived it so completely that even emperors felt little next to him. Now try to impress your pals after that. Good luck. Diogenes was not merely a strange person in his town anymore. He was the personification of a new style of thinking, one that was not the watered-down form we use today when someone is unhappy about politics. No, the original cynicism was wild, dirty, and had fleas. Diogenes thought that civilization was bad because it was based on lies. Lies about being happy, good, and successful. People spend their whole lives trying to get rich, move up the social ladder, and fill their heads with meaningless ideas. Diogenes looked at all of that and responded, "No thanks. I would rather sleep in a pot and eat scraps." At its heart, cynicism was about living in harmony with nature. That meant letting up of all the fake needs, like fame, luxury, and political ambition, and going back to a simple life where you can take care of yourself. If you did not get a golden goblet from nature, you might not need one. If you have a stomach, then sure. Begging for food or stealing an onion was more honest than complimenting a politician. His philosophy was likewise very aggressive. Diogenes did not try to hide his opinions in essays or temple scrolls. He lived them out loud. He made fun of people, yelled at them, and even physically got in the way of their lives to make them recognize their own contradictions. Diogenes would follow someone around like a philosophical heckler if they preached virtue yet lived in luxury, showing how rotten the silk was. Diogenes thought that actions were much more important than thoughts. He even remarked, "Other dogs bite their enemies. I bite my friends to save them." Because nothing says friendship like a good figurative nibble on the ankle of your delusions, he was very harsh on hypocrites, especially those who were philosophers. Diogenes would hold up a mirror, either literally or figuratively. If a scholar said that being poor was noble while living in comfort, he once witnessed a huge temple being erected and said, "The gods must have gone blind if they need such a grand house." In a world that cares so much about how things look, Diogenes was image's natural enemy. He stripped everything down, both literally and figuratively, while others hid their goals behind words. He did not care if others liked him. He was attempting to get folks to wake up, and if that meant barking like a dog or peeing on public sculptures, then so be it. Truth, after all, was not always nice. Diogenes was not merely a thinker. He was the conscience of Athens on foot, one that is dirty, loud, and very annoying. Some people thought he was crazy and could not control his bowels, while others thought he was the only normal person in a city full of liars. Maybe both. He made a living by making others upset during a feast. He walked barefoot across the beautiful carpet in the banquet hall, wiping the muck off his feet, and said, "Thus I trample on the pride of Plato." This was hardly polite behaviour, but for Diogenes, it was more than that. It was a protest against being vain, overdoing things, and all the empty rituals people did to feel important. He dared everyone. When he saw a rich man giving money to the poor just to be admired, Diogenes said, "That is not charity, that is investment." Another time, he saw a man getting angry after being slapped and said, "You should not be upset. It was just flesh hitting flesh." This was not just philosophy. It was psychological judo. But the real genius of Diogenes was not just in what he said, it was how he lived. His daily life was a critique of everything people took for granted. He turned the world upside down and held it there, waiting to see what coins fell out. Not everyone appreciated the free lessons, though. He was ridiculed, attacked, and even arrested. Trying to arrest a man with no possessions and no shame was like trying to take away smoke. In one city, after being captured and sold as a slave, yes, really, he calmly told the auctioneer, "Sell me to a man who needs a master. Let that sink in." He ended up with a Corinthian man named Xeniades, who didn't just buy Diogenes. He took him home and let him run the household, educate the children, and essentially become a sarcastic live-in life coach. Somehow, Diogenes turned slavery into a lecture series, whether insulting kings or mentoring children. Diogenes stayed painfully consistent. He mocked all power structures, even ones he accidentally became part of. If someone ever did try to praise him too much, he'd remind them that he was just a dog chasing truth and occasionally peeing on golden statues. He was society's permanent splinter. The more you tried to ignore him, the deeper he lodged into your conscience. To say Diogenes had strong opinions about social conventions would be like saying the sun is a bit warm. He didn't just reject polite customs. He launched a one-man war against them with the ferocity of a barefoot prophet and the hygiene of a disobedient raccoon. Bathing overrated dining etiquette, pointless shame, a tool used by cowards and hypocrites to hide behind marble columns. Diogenes believed that most societal norms weren't there to help people. They existed to control them, to shame them into conformity, and to separate the powerful from the poor. So naturally, he decided to live in a way that defied every single one of them. He often walked around barefoot through broken streets, even in the winter. When asked why he didn't wear shoes like a normal person, he replied, "If I were in need of shoes, I'd be more distressed about my life than my feet." Diogenes also had a knack for performing embarrassing bodily functions in public and not out of ignorance. He knew exactly what he was doing. These acts weren't random, they were statements. He believed that if something was natural and necessary, it shouldn't be a source of shame. In other words, if you're going to scold me for burping but not for cheating your neighbour, your moral compass is broken. Even begging became a form of resistance. While most beggars tried to appeal to pity or social obligation, Diogenes treated it as a spiritual test for himself and the person being asked. If they gave, fine. If not, that was fine too. Either way, he stayed honest and hungry. But Diogenes wasn't just rebelling for rebellion's sake. His whole existence was an ongoing experiment to see how little a person needed to live well. Not just survive, live well. With dignity, with freedom, with a sense of humour sharp enough to slice through the pomp of politicians and the polished language of philosophers. He exposed the absurdity of conventions by ignoring them entirely. And the more people insisted he behaved normally, the more he doubled down, proving that many so-called civilized behaviours were really just rituals we performed to make ourselves feel superior, in a world that obsessed over masks. Diogenes was barefaced and probably barefoot, laughing in the sun, asking us why we weren't. Diogenes, of course, didn't leave behind memoirs, marble busts, or temples in his honour. He wouldn't have wanted them. In fact, if someone had tried to build him a statue, he probably would have spat on it. His legacy lives not in what he created, but in what he destroyed: illusions, pretensions, and egos. As for his death, like everything else about Diogenes, it's surrounded by stories that are somewhere between tragic, ridiculous, and profoundly fitting. Some say he died from holding his breath out of boredom with life. Others claim he succumbed to an infected dog bite. Irony not lost on anyone familiar with his nickname. And then there's the version where he simply lay down, said nothing, and didn't get back up. No grand last words, no dramatic curtain clothes, just the world's loudest cynic slipping away silently, as if even death didn't impress him. When asked how he wanted to be buried, Diogenes reportedly replied, "Throw me outside the city wall and let the beasts have me," shocked. Someone asked if he was worried about animals tearing him apart. Diogenes answered, "Not if you give me a stick to chase them away." "But you won't be able to use it," the man pointed out. "Then why should I care what happens to me when I'm dead?" Diogenes 1, mortality 0. In the centuries after his death, Diogenes' teachings didn't disappear. They spread like wildfire among those who were tired of hypocrisy. His brand of cynicism inspired a whole school of thought, influencing later Stoics like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, who borrowed the idea of self-sufficiency and virtue untainted by wealth or reputation. Even today, in an age obsessed with filters, followers, and fortune, Diogenes still feels oddly relevant. He's a reminder that true freedom isn't found in owning more, it's in needing less. That dignity doesn't come from titles, but from living in line with your values. Even if those values include yelling at statues and living in a barrel, he may have died penniless, homeless, and barefoot. But Diogenes left behind something far more durable than gold, the uncomfortable truth, the kind that sticks in your brain like a splinter and dares you to laugh at yourself, or at least question why you're not carrying a lantern. You'd think a man who barked at citizens, slept in a jar, and publicly scolded Plato would be a forgotten footnote in philosophy. And yet, Diogenes has become a symbol not of madness, but of radical honesty in a world built on illusion. The fact that we still talk about him over 2,000 years later says something. It says that deep down people are still hungry for truth, even if it smells like onions and lives in a barrel. Diogenes matters today because his life was a provocation. He dared to ask, what happens when you stop playing along? What if you quit trying to get money, fame, or even comfort and just live with what you have? Take away all the performance, the polite lies, and the carefully chosen identities. What remains, Diogenes says, that what is left is actual freedom. In a world where looks matter, like ancient Athens or Instagram, his refusal to care about them hurts more than ever. He did not merely question money or power. He asked why they were needed. That is why so many people, from Stoics to anarchists to comedians, have looked to him for ideas. He is the first minimalist, and every story you read online about someone who abandoned their six-figure career to live in a van is based on him. Diogenes' crudesse has a location. He utilised shock not to hurt people, but to show them. He wanted people to feel uncomfortable since that is where thinking about things begins. Diogenes would respond that your priorities are wrong if you care more about people peeing in public than about corruption in government or greed in religion. And even though his tactics were strange, the main idea is still true today. You cannot buy, brand, or broadcast virtue. It is how you act when no one is watching, or in Diogenes' case, when everyone is watching and you do not care. He reminds us that wise people do not always wear robes. It can yell from a jar, laugh in your face, and not move out of the sun. Diogenes asks us to be something different in a world full of noise, branding, and bullshit. He wants us to be honest, unfiltered, and a little bit like a dog. And that might be why he is the smartest crazy person that ever lived. By the early 1870s, the Northern Plains were full of tension, broken promises, land theft, and cultural clashes had been building up for a long time. The Black Hills were at the core of it all. The Lakota Sioux called it Pahasapa, which means sacred place. The US government had agreed in the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty that this land belonged to the Lakota. They had the land on paper forever, but in this situation, forever meant around 6 years. In 1874, an expedition commanded by George Armstrong Custer found gold in the Black Hills. This altered everything. Word got out, and thousands of prospectors flocked to the area, breaking the treaty and desecrating sacred territory. Instead of following through on its own commitment, the government tried to buy the land from the Lakota. They said no. This was not just about money. It was about staying alive, having control over their own lives, and losing their way of life. Washington now saw the Lakota and their allies as enemies. They were not talking things over. They were fighting back. By January 31, 1876, the US Army had to move all native populations to reserves. Anyone who did not follow the rules would be seen as an enemy. A lot of them did not even get the message because they were spread out throughout a lot of winter hunting sites. Others just said no. They did not want to give up their freedom for a life of reliance and imprisonment. What was happening on the plains was not just a disagreement. It was on a path to collide. A group of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors commanded by famous people like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse started to come together. They were hardly a real army, but they were all working together to safeguard their country, their people, and their way of life. They understood that battle was on the way. At the same time, US military planners thought the tribes were disorganized and split up because they were sure of their numbers and technology. They were completely wrong. The warriors on the plain were very mobile, knew the land well, and were fighting for very important reasons. The powder keg was set on fire. The fuse was on B, and shortly, the fight that would become the Battle of Little Bighorn was on its way to becoming history. George Armstrong Custer was not your typical military officer. He was a household name by 1876. He was a flashy, polarising Civil War hero known for being brave, daring, and dangerously addicted to fame. Custer looked more like he belonged on stage than on the battlefield because of his long blonde hair, bright clothes, and love of headlines. But his bravery had won him both praise and hate. Custer was given the job of Lieutenant Colonel in the 7th US Cavalry in the Western Frontier after the Civil War. His mission was to carry out federal Indian policy, which more and more involved quietly moving native tribes to reservations, and if that did not work forcefully, Custer was ready to battle by 1876. He wanted to be president, and a big military victory could help him get his name back following a public fight with President Ulysses Grant's administration. He was not simply after Indians, he was after being important. As things had got worse between the Lakota and their allies, Custer was told to take part in a three-pronged effort to find and capture the so-called hostiles. The goal was to surround the native camps and make them give up. Custer's column would come from the east. General John Gibbons's troops would come from the west, and General George Crook's troops would come from the south. But the idea was too confident and poorly coordinated from the start. The land was rough, the distances were long, and the intelligence was at best flimsy. Custer and most other US officers thought they were up against a tiny, disorganized group of fighters. They did not know that thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had joined together for a summer gathering near the Little Bighorn River. This was the greatest native army ever to convene on the plains. As usual, Custer wanted to hit immediately and take all the credit for himself. He turned down help, did not want to carry Gatling guns that would slow him down, and did not follow orders to wait. Instead, he moved forward with his 600 soldiers, breaking them into 3 battalions for a surprise attack. It was brave, daring, and completely wrong. Because what lay ahead was not a village of people who had lost their way. It was a strong, united army that was ready to protect its way of life. And Custer, who was known for his flair, was going to ride straight into folklore and calamity. The US Army was using bad maps and making bad guesses. Yet something amazing was unfolding along the banks of the Little Bighorn River. Thousands of Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho had come together, not to fight at first, but to set up camp for the summer. It was a time to relax, hunt, hold ceremonies, and spend time with family and friends, but the political situation in 1876 made the meeting less fun. The leaders of the natives knew what was going to happen. They had seen the treaties breached, the buffalo herds dwindle, and the railroads and settlers move in. They knew that this camp, which looked serene, could soon turn into a fight, and they were not going to flee away. Sitting Bull, a renowned Anglo-Lakota spiritual man and visionary leader, was at the core of this developing group. In the weeks before the war, he did a great sun dance, which is a hard ceremonial of prayer and sacrifice. Witnesses say that Sitting Bull saw something while he was dancing. He watched soldiers falling into the camp like grasshoppers, broken and defeated. For his supporters, this was not a figure of speech. It was a prophecy. And then there was Crazy Horse, a warrior whose skill and daring were practically legendary. He was quiet, kept to himself, and very dedicated to keeping his people safe. People already knew Crazy Horse was a brave leader from other wars. He would soon show himself again by storming straight into enemy lines with a mix of bravery and tactical genius. Other leaders, such as Gall and Two Moons, also became important voices. The tribes did not have a single central authority, yet they were very united at this time. They were fighting for more than just land. They were fighting for independence. There may have been between 8,000 and 10,000 Aboriginal people living in the Little Bighorn Valley, including 500 to 2,000 warriors. They were well armed, with several of them carrying repeating rifles and knowing the area better than anyone else. And most importantly, they were fighting for their homes, their families, and the way they lived. Custer thought there would be a few hundred desperate fighters, Instead, he was about to encounter a powerful group of people who were not only fighting against him, but also because of their strong beliefs, their obligation to their ancestors, and their great determination to live. The storm was becoming worse. On June 22, 1876, Custer and his 7th Cavalry left the mouth of the Rosebud River and followed traces that were thought to lead to a neighbouring native camp. They proceeded quickly for 3 days, too quickly, tiring out both men and horses. Custer was sure that the native village would run away if they found out that soldiers were coming. He intended to hit first, hit hard, and take the glory before General Terry or Gibbon could get there and take the spotlight. But this sense of haste made him forget to be careful. Scouts, including famous Crow and Arikara warriors, told Custer that the hamlet ahead was huge and unlike anything they had ever seen. Some even ascended to ridges and came back with wide eyes, saying, "Too many to count." They told Custer to wait and think about it again. He didn't. Custer got to a ridge that looked across the Little Bighorn Valley on the morning of June 25th. He could see some of the big camp from a distance here. The teepee stretched down the river like a little town. There was smoke coming from the cooking fires. Horses grazed as kids played. But what he thought was a weak camp was really a sleeping giant. Custer still thought he could surprise them, so he made the unfortunate choice to split his 600-man unit. He dispatched Captain Frederick Bentine and 25 soldiers to look for things to the south. Major Marcus Reno was told to send 40 soldiers to attack the southern end of the hamlet. Custer, on the other hand, led approximately 210 men north, expecting to flank the town from behind and trap the warriors in a pincer move. It was brave, it was dangerous, and it was founded on completely wrong ideas. Custer had no idea that the warriors already knew the soldiers were coming. Lakota scouts saw moving columns and trails of dust. The element of surprise was gone before it even started. When Reno's men went down into the valley, they did not see families running around in a panic. They saw warriors coming together, and there were more than they had ever thought there would be. Instead of giving up, the camp fought back in an organised way, commanded by the very people Custer had thought were weak. At that moment, the idea that the US Army could never be beaten started to fall apart. The 7th Cavalry was going into a storm that they could not escape, and Custer was leading the charge right into the middle of it, about 300 p.m. On June 25th, 1876, Major Marcus Reno and his soldiers attacked the southern end of the native camp. They thought there would be panic, women and children running away and warriors rushing about. Instead, they received a well-planned, angry fight back. In a matter of minutes, the accusation fell apart. Reno's men got down their horses in the woods along the river and started shooting, but they were surprised by how much flames was coming back. There were a lot of warriors, and they were also fierce, quick, and well-coordinated. Many of the Lakota and Cheyenne fighters were on horseback and moved over the wide ground at scary speeds, shooting with deadly accuracy. Some had Winchesters and Spencer repeating rifles, which were better than the single-shot carbines that the cavalry used. Reno got scared. He didn't stay where he was. Instead, he gave a confusing order to mount and cross the river. A lot of soldiers were shot down during the fight. Some people drowned. The retreat becomes a path. Reno's troops were bloodied and disordered as they staggered up a bluff on the east side of the river, seeking to get into a defensive position. At that moment, Captain Frederick Bentine came from the south with more troops. Reno and he set up a rudimentary boundary on top of what would subsequently be dubbed Reno Hill. They dug in there, low on water, surrounded, and under continual fire. They could hear gunshots in the north, which was Custer's own fate, but they did not know what was going on. They dispatched messengers, but none came back. In the valley below, native warriors rushed over the battlefield, encouraged by Reno's retreat. The spirits went up. The prophecy was coming true. The invaders were not unbeatable. They were running away, and more were approaching. Until now, US military operations on the plains had been rather easy to guess. Native communities had learnt to expect overwhelming force, quick attacks, and terrible punishment, but this was not the same. The warriors were battling on their own terms. moving around, resolute, and full of vision and wrath. Reno was still alive on the mountaintop, but he did not know what had gone wrong. Custer, on the other hand, was still moving north, not knowing that the whole tactical framework he had been using had already fallen apart. The fight was no longer about tactics. It had turned into survival, and Custer's time was running out. Reno's troops were running away in a panic, and Benteen was building up Reno Hill. Custer and his 210 men moved north, completely unaware of how big the combat was going on behind them, still thinking that the settlement could be assaulted from more than one side. Custer's group advanced along the highland, hoping to attack the back of the hamlet, but the warriors knew he was approaching. The alarm had now thoroughly spread through the huge camp. Hundreds of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors rushed toward Custer's column. Custer did not locate any women or children to take. Instead, he found a huge wave of mounted fighters. His forces were spread out along the ridgelines and hills, trying to defend their ground, but they were rapidly overwhelmed. People still disagree over the exact order of the fight. None in Custer's immediate command lived through the event, but it is apparent that the 7th Cavalry was defeated in just a few hours. The native forces, led by warriors like Crazy Horse and Ghoul, were better at moving about and had more men than Custer's. Their better understanding of the land and aggressive tactics broke apart the cavalry's ranks. The men struggled to hold their ground on what would subsequently be known as Last Stand Hill. They fell because they were surrounded, out of ammo, and had no way to get away. Some were in small groups, while others were by themselves. Some people are said to be trying to shoot themselves instead of being caught. Native stories said the fight was quick and brutal. It was not simply a quarrel, it was a breakdown. Custer died in the last few seconds, probably from a gunshot to the chest and skull. He was found with a group of individuals, including his brothers Tom and Boston Custer. He lost almost all of the soldiers in his command. More than 200 men died. It was a huge and emotional win for the Aboriginal warriors, but it was not celebrated with pride. Some stories say that people were sad instead than happy, which shows that they knew the war was not ended even if they had won the fight. The US Army would come back, and this moment of glory would be met with revenge. But for one day, amid the sweeping hills of Montana, the relentless juggernaut of westward expansion had stopped, and Custer, the brave commander who was looking for a legacy, had found it not in victory but in death. After the dust settled on the night of June 25th, the hills of the Little Bighorn were quiet again. There were still fires burning, ammo belts all over the place, and more than 200 troops from the 7th Cavalry were dead, including George Armstrong Custer and almost all of the officers who worked for him directly. There were shattered weapons, dead horses, and the bodies of soldiers who had no idea what was going to happen on the battlefield. But the local victory, as comprehensive as it was, came with a dismal realization. This was not the end. It was a spark. The US administration was quite angry and embarrassed, and they would not forgive what they called a slaughter. Back east, newspapers blasted headlines about Custer's last stand, making him look like a martyr, and the local warriors looked like murderous aggressors. The context, the treaty infractions, the gold rush onto holy grounds, and the fight's defensive nature were all neatly left out of the national story. In the days that followed, native families grieved for their own losses. They had won, but they had lost people as well, and they knew that the US would react quickly. Some leaders, like Sitting Bull, told the people to hurry up. They took down the big camp and split up into smaller groups that spread out throughout the plains, getting ready for the attack they knew was coming. Soon after, US troops, who had been given more weapons and supplies, came to the area. Washington's resolve only became stronger after the loss at Little Bighorn. Policies got tougher. People broke treaties. More soldiers came. Negotiation was no longer the goal. It was control. Sitting Bull subsequently fled to Canada to avoid being caught. Crazy Horse, on the other hand, kept fighting for another year before being slain in 1877 under strange circumstances. Many bands were pushed onto reservations where they were hungry and outgunned, and their freedom was taken away. 2 days later, relief soldiers found the battleground itself. The The scene they found was scary and sad. A lot of soldiers had their uniforms and gear taken away, a historic martial practice that was aimed to take away the dignity of opponents. Some dead were cut up, while others were left alone, depending on tribal norms and how bad the combat was, but no one could deny what had happened. Custer had left, the 7th Cavalry was destroyed, and for a brief period, native resistance had done the impossible. They had won. The Battle of Little Bighorn was more than just a fight between soldiers. History twisted and turned it into a weapon. It was a rare and hard-fought triumph for the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho against all odds. The US government and its people were humiliated, and they wanted quick, harsh punishment. The story quickly changed in the minds of Americans. Custer went from being a wild glory seeker to a tragic hero, the brave commander who fought until the end. His decisions were complicated, his tactics were arrogant, and the US invasion of treaty-protected lands was unfair. All of these things were hidden by a surge of patriotic myths. The press called the native triumph a bloodbath, which made it seem like it was a war on native ground, but the fight was remembered extremely differently by native groups. It was a time of coming together, bravery, and prophecy coming true. The big camp at the Little Bighorn was the last great moment of freedom before the long shadow of life on the reservation drew in. For a lot of people, the conflict was a source of pride and a sign of strength and resistance. It showed that the native inhabitants of the plains were not just passive victims, but also active protectors of their world. But the price of that win came quickly. Military campaigns got more intense within a few months. The buffalo herds, which were already in bad shape, were purposefully attacked to cut off the Aboriginal food supply. People were always looking for tribes. By the year 1877, Crazy Horse was dead. Sitting Bull would live longer, but he would also be killed in 1890, just days before the Wounded Knee Massacre, which was another sad step toward the end of Aboriginal sovereignty. The legacy of Little Bighorn became two things: a source of inspiration and a reason to lament. It showed how brutal US expansion was, how unfulfilled promises were, and how fierce a people were who would not go away meekly. The battleground is now a national memorial. For years, there was merely a memorial to Custer and his soldiers, but more recently, memorials have been put up to remember the native warriors who battled and died there, not as bad guys, but as heroes protecting their homes. The hills remember both sides. The wind carries both of the songs, and the legacy of Little Bighorn still speaks if you are open to hearing more than one interpretation of history. The Battle of Little Bighorn is one of those rare times in American history when the underdog not only fought back but also prevailed. For one day in 1876, tribal warriors stopped the flow of an empire. They did not win because they had more people, better technology, or more money. They prevailed because they were brave, worked together, and were determined to maintain their way of life. But the sad thing about Little Bighorn is that this win did not change the course of history. It just put it off. It actually sped up the end. Washington was furious when Custer lost so badly. People's opinions become more firm. Where there was sympathy for native problems, it was buried behind waves of revenge and nationalism. Congress gave the military more money. The struggle against the tribes of the plains got worse and worse. The nomadic way of life that had been a part of Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lot culture for hundreds of years was gone in just a few years. The buffalo were almost gone. The bookings were cut apart. The land was divided up. The hills that had once boomed with hooves and war screams were now quiet. But Little Bighorn would not go away. It has been rethought, reimagined, and taken back throughout the years. It began as a story of brave sacrifice for many Americans. For some, it slowly became a sign of unfairness, of a country that abandoned its promise and called opposition treason. Today, the location is one of the few battlefields where both sides are remembered, and where the markers do not all point in the same direction. For Indigenous peoples, the war is still very important. It is not the start of their loss, but the last great stand of a free people, a time when they fought with all their might for all that was being taken from them, including land, freedom, and respect. It was and still is a holy memory. Little Bighorn teaches us all a hard yet important lesson about power, myths, and the price of conquering. It reminds us that the winners do not always tell the story of history. Sometimes it is buried under them, waiting to be found. Custer may have gained the glory in the end, but the warriors of Little Bighorn got something that would live longer: the truth and the right to speak. We were here and we fought. People did not only build the Forbidden City, it was made real via hard work, determination, and a strong desire for control. The Yongle Emperor of the Ming dynasty ordered the building of a new imperial residence in Beijing in 1406. He wanted to transfer the capital from Nanjing, but this castle was not going to be like any other. It would become the heart of the Chinese Empire, a guarded city within a city where no one could enter without being called, and no secrets could leave its gates. More than 1 million workers, craftsmen, and engineers laboured on this huge project over the following 14 years. The materials came from all around the empire. They brought in huge slabs of marble from Sichuan, golden Nanmu wood, and millions of glazed roof tiles that were cooked to perfection. An empire's pride was set in stone, brick by brick. When it was done, the Forbidden City was around 80 acres big and included more than 900 buildings. It was laid out in a traditional Confucian way, symmetrical, ordered, and hierarchical. The Hall of Supreme Concord was at the centre of it all, where emperors were crowned and orders echoed through the government. But the underlying goal was psychological, not just spectacular. This was not only a place to live, it was a statement. The emperor does not dwell with you. He resides above you. And do not get it wrong, that was really against the law. Most people in Beijing never went inside. Even high-ranking officials could only come in with permission from the emperor. There were guards at every gate. There were spies in every hallway. Markets and everyday life were busy in the outlying city. But inside the scarlet walls, time moved slowly and ceremonial was in charge. It was a world where rituals were the norm, where things were mysterious, and where people were safe from the chaos of everyday life. The Forbidden City was a pressure cooker. Nevertheless, under its golden roofs and red columns, it was constructed to keep people apart, maintain power in one place, and protect the emperor from both physical and political threats. It would eventually become a location where people plotted, betrayed, and whispered in the dark. Yes, it is a palace, but it is also a stage for 500 years of empire, ambition, and steady decline. It was stunning from the outside. It watched from the inside and never forgot who roamed its corridors. The emperor, who was the son of heaven, was at the centre of the Forbidden City. He was the living bridge between the mortal world and the heavenly. But even though he was the most powerful person in the universe, the king on the throne often lived a very lonely existence. The prohibited taste did not just keep the monarch safe, it also ate him up. Every day of his life was planned out in excruciating detail. He woke up to music, had attendants clothe him, and followed a regimen that was so strict it was almost like a play. They checked the food for poison. Ministers knelt in front of him and read documents out loud. Even going for a walk in the gardens required ceremonial clearance and a lot of help. There was nothing spontaneous. People were watching everything. And even though the emperor was at the top of the hierarchy, he was not free at all. The same framework that made him great also kept him locked up. The emperor rarely saw the outside world, because he was always surrounded by layers of eunuchs, ministers, consorts, and spies. The vast machinery of court etiquette often stopped him from acting on his own, especially in later dynasties. He was only given certain information and had to follow certain rules when he interacted with others. Some emperors, like Yongle or Kangxi, who governed with an iron fist and knew how to run the government, did this with merciless efficiency. Some people become paranoid, decadent, or detached, like a golden ghost trapped in their own palace. Some emperors stayed in the Forbidden City for months or even years without ever leaving. The world they governed could have been on the moon, even inside the palace. It was hard to get to the emperor. It could take days for high-ranking officials to get an audience. Family members did not see each other very often, and the servant who crossed the wrong threshold was in big trouble. Protocol told you where to stand, how to bow, and even what you could see. The emperor could give orders to legions with just one word, in real life. He often had a hard time figuring out who to trust or what was really going on outside his walls. The throne could have been made of jade and placed on top of dragons, but it was also surrounded by curtains, layers of mystery and ritual. The Forbidden City crowned its ruler with gold, but it also kept him quiet. There was an unseen army behind every throne in the Forbidden City. It was not made up of generals or ministers, but of eunuchs, males who had been castrated and worked in the palace. Eunuchs started out as simple servants, but they grew to be some of the most powerful and feared people in Imperial China. In a culture where women were kept away from men and men were dangerous, eunuchs were in a peculiar middle ground. They were close to the emperor, yet strategically helpful, because they could never start competing dynasties. At first, their jobs were easy. They took care of royal tasks, delivered letters, and took care of imperial robes. Eunuchs started to fill the gap as monarchs got more reclusive, especially during the Ming and Qing dynasties. They controlled who could see the emperor, filtered information, and finally took over all of the administrative tasks. Some had more power than generals, some people had more influence over the emperor than even his own family did, and with power came greed and dishonesty. The history of eunuchs in the Forbidden City is a cycle of success and failure. There was a scheme that changed imperial decisions, silenced opponents, and hoarded wealth for every loyal subordinate. Some eunuchs, like Wu Jiangxian during the late Ming period, governed the empire from behind silk screens. His adversaries disappeared, his friends were elevated, and whole ministries were afraid of what he said. But eunuchs' impact was not merely political, it was personal. They took care of the emperor since he was a child, watched him grow up, and often acted as father figures, teachers or helpers. They were always there, in the emperor's rooms, his study and his court. If the emperor was lonely, it was often the eunuchs who knew about it and occasionally took advantage of it, but their lives were not at all lavish. Many boys, mainly from poor families, were forcibly castrated in the hopes of getting them a job in the palace. People who lived through the harsh procedure and years of menial work could, with skill and chance, move up in status. Confucian intellectuals and military leaders always looked at them with distrust. They were tolerated, employed, and then blamed when things went wrong. The eunuchs were the quiet hands that moved the pieces in a city based on ritual and mystery. Not kings or pawns, but something much more complex and dangerous. The inner court was the most exclusive part of the Forbidden City, and it was behind the vast halls and tall gates. There were a lot of palaces, gardens, and sleeping rooms behind the crimson walls where the emperor lived. Here, the affairs of state were replaced by the affairs of the dynasty, including consorts, concubines, and offspring. And here, politics changed into a more personal shape, where beauty, jealousy, and family ties were the most important things. There were 3 main palaces in the inner court for the emperor to use, and 6 houses for the empress and her concubines to live in. But do not let the peaceful titles and flowery gardens mislead you. This was not a peaceful place to relax. It was a war zone where dozens, possibly hundreds, of women were fighting for favour. There were veiled threats, whispered alliances, and planned ambition among the inner court. The empress, who was the emperor's legal wife, was at the top. She had status and formality, but not always his love. The emperor's heart and heirs often came from his concubines. Their position may change overnight just on a look, a pregnancy, or even just a rumour. Some had sons and rose to power, others sank into obscurity, their names forgotten and their futures silently destroyed. Palace maids and senior eunuchs served as middlemen, messengers, and, at times, spies. Nothing happened without being noticed. There was nothing that was forgotten. The ladies in the court did not have much independence, but they held power in less obvious ways, like through charm, manipulation, and sometimes poison. Sometimes a consort would become so popular that she would rule through the emperor. One of the most well-known was Empress Daja Cixi, who went from being a low-ranking concubine to being the de facto ruler of China for almost 50 years. Her power started behind these exact walls, behind locked doors, in silk robes, with a great intellect that was patient. People who were not there thought the inner court was quiet and smelled well, and that it was a place of art, music, and refinement. But behind the lattice windows and painted screens, it was a pressure chamber where prestige, survival, and bloodline came together. Power did not just march in boots and robes in the Forbidden City. Sometimes it sneaked through moonlit hallways in embroidered slippers, smiling sweetly and waiting to strike. Every move inside the Forbidden City meant something. Every stride, every bow, and every offering of incense. There was no casual behaviour. This was not just a castle. It was a machine from God. And the Emperor was more than simply a guy. He was the son of heaven, the link between the ground and the sky. That meant that every action he made had a lot of power. It was not only about power, it was about rules. Every morning, officials stood in line at the Meridian Gate long before the sun came up, waiting for the morning court audience. These sessions were short and very planned out. Ministers knelt, only spoke when addressed to, and gave their memorials with a lot of humility. They were strong men outside the palace. They were shadows at the emperor's feet on the inside. One of the most important ceremonies was the winter solstice ceremony, in which the emperor made sacrifices at the Temple of Heaven to keep the peace between heaven and earth. You had to do these rituals. They were like political theatre on a holy level. People thought that a failed ceremony, bad weather, or forgetting a rite might mean that the mandate of heaven was getting weaker. Rituals controlled every part of life inside the castle: weddings, funerals, births, and even meals. Many people checked the emperor's food, tasted it for poison, and prepared it according to stringent rules. If the emperor changed the menu without asking, it might cause a lot of trouble in both the chefs and the court, but maybe the most telling ritual was being quiet. You did not talk to the emperor unless he talked to you. You did not make eye contact with him. His family even bowed, stood up, and walked away. There has to be distance. There was not much closeness. As time went on, the fixation with ritual became a bad thing. It kept everything going, organised, and legal for hundreds of years on the other side. On the other hand, it made it impossible to make decisions. While the world outside changed, ministers talked about protocol, foreign powers moved forward, revolution began, but inside the Forbidden City, the officials were still fighting about how many ceremonial steps a royal procession should have. The rituals that used to give people power started to make it stronger. They kept the empire going, but they also kept it from moving, like a clock with exquisite paint that did not work anymore. The show went on inside those gilded walls, perfect, exact, and less important. There was a world under the lacquered beams and glittering tiles of the Forbidden City that could not be seen in art. A world full of whispers, shadows, and never-ending doubt. The walls kept foes out, but they could not keep ambition in, and in a palace where power was held, passed down, and often unstable. The biggest threats were not armies at the gates. They were your servants in your room. It was not merely common to spy. It became part of the system. Eunuchs told other eunuchs what it was doing. Palace servants talked behind closed doors. Even concubines had spies who bribed or blackmailed lower-level workers to get information about their rivals. The emperor's word was law. But most of the time, he did not know which words to believe. It was normal to be paranoid. The letters were opened. People heard conversations. A casual comment could be turned into treason. There were a lot of false charges. A whisper may make a minister famous one day and send them into exile the next. Families vanished overnight. Some people chose to kill themselves instead of going to trial, because they knew what would happen to them if they fought back. The eunuchs were both involved in and enforced this hidden battle. Some people were devoted to and protected the emperor, but others set up networks of spies that were just as good as secret police. The infamous Eastern Depot, a eunuch-run spy agency, was given horrifying power during the Ming dynasty, the power to arrest, question, and to kill people without asking the civil authority for permission. It was normal to torture people. They pulled confessions out of them like teeth. And even while court professors and officials did not like how eunuchs affected things, they were not above being sneaky themselves. Every promotion, marriage arrangement, and imperial edict was a play in an ongoing game on the chessboard of the court. Sometimes the emperor was a pawn, especially if he was young, unwell, or did not want to rule. Regents and dowagers tugged the strings, smiling during the day and hitting at night. In this world, success required silence, cunning, and a perfect memory for who was on your side. A one mistake, even an unguarded glance, may be deadly, but people kept making plans, because in the Forbidden City, being close to the throne was the best thing that could happen to you, and losing it was the worst. The city under the rites and crimson walls never really slept. It only watched and waited. The Forbidden City may have seemed like it would last forever, with its red walls that never changed and its golden roofs that shone in the light, but inside dynasties came and went at an astonishing rate. From a distance, power that looked divine often turned out to be deadly up close. And sometimes the empire did not fall in the battlefield. It dropped in a quiet hallway behind a barred door that those closest to the throne murmured out of existence. The Ming dynasty, which created the Forbidden City, was in power for about 300 years. But by the 1600s, it was too much for its own bureaucracy, corruption, and peasant uprisings to handle. While poverty and discontent grew outside, the palace had become a maze of ceremonial obsessions and eunuch domination. The final Ming emperor hanged himself in the palace gardens in 1604 as rebel armies were getting closer to Beijing. He left a note saying how sorry he was for failing in a palace that was ready to be taken over. The Manchu, a foreign power from the northeast, came in and set up the Qing dynasty. They elected to maintain the Forbidden City as their seat of power, which is amazing. They changed its traditions and added their own. The buildings stayed the same, but the language, clothes, and traditions changed. Once again, crimson walls took the shock of the change and held up the sense of continuity. The Qing governed from the Forbidden City for 28 more years, going through times of great wealth and terrible loss. The emperors of the late Qing dynasty, notably in the 19th century, had a hard time dealing with modern challenges: Western imperialism, uprisings from within, and a lack of progress in technology. At the same time, Empress Daja Kixi governed from behind a curtain, actually controlling court politics while saying no to changes that could have rescued the empire. When the boy emperor Puai became emperor in 1908, the Forbidden City was more of a museum than a place of authority. The Qing dynasty came to an end in 1912, ending more than 2,000 years of imperial control. But strangely, Puyi was allowed to stay in the Forbidden City for another 13 years, like a ghost walking over the remains of his own past. The emperors were gone, but the city was still there, empty, grand, and haunted by the sounds of long-lost dynasties. The walls were still standing, but the thrones inside them were not. The Forbidden City should have been quiet after the Qing Empire ended in 1912. Instead, it began one of the oddest parts of its 500-year existence. The monarchy was no more, the new government in China was a republic, but there was still a child emperor inside the crimson walls. Puyi, who is 6 years old and still wears dragon robes, still bows to meaningless rites, and still rules over nothing. This strange arrangement came about because of a political deal. The new Republican government let Puyi stay in the Forbidden City's inner court, which was cut off from the streets of Beijing. Warlords fought for dominance outside, and revolution changed society. Time stopped within. Eunuchs kept doing their jobs. The meals were presented in a ceremonial way. The emperor got up, got dressed, and was bowed to. A king without a kingdom. A youngster living in a fantasy that has already come true. But Puyi could see he started to doubt the world around him as he got older. He read newspapers that had been sneaked into the palace. He observed planes flying above him. He lived in a museum of fading grandeur while the modern world hummed around him. He realized that the empire was really gone. Even though no one acknowledged it out loud, his loneliness made him angry, curious, and finally rebellious. A huge fire broke out at the palace in 1923, a fire that looked suspicious and destroyed valuable items. Pui kicked off hundreds of Unix users after accusing them of stealing and damaging things. Hundreds of years of palace tradition were lost in a single night. The metropolis that was off-limits was getting less crowded. In 1924, a warlord named Fang Yuqiang eventually forced Pui out of the palace for good. The emperor, who was now a young man, was taken out via the same gates that emperors had governed from for hundreds of years. They carried him on a rickshaw. There was no throne, no honour guard, just a lost figure enveloped in memories of lost authority. But Pui's narrative did not stop there. He would later work with the Japanese, become a puppet dictator in Manchuria, and then be caught, imprisoned, and re-educated by the communist government. He worked as a gardener in his last years, taking care of flowers in Beijing and living quietly not far from the palace that had once defined him. Pui was the last person to reside in the Forbidden City. When he went, the empire died with him. The Forbidden City does not keep secrets anymore. It shows them. Millions of people can now go to places that were once off-limits to most of China. The Palace Museum is now a memorial not only to the majesty of emperors, but also to the many layers of history, power, and identity that built a civilization. Visitors today walk through its gates and under the same tall red walls that previously scared diplomats and rang with Unix's footsteps. The roofs are still shiny in the sun, and the dragon patterns are still as furious as ever. But now, instead of guards and courtiers, you'll see tour guides, selfie sticks, and school kids with notebooks. There are more than 1.8 million antiques, scrolls, paintings, china, ceremonial clothes, weaponry, and personal items of emperors and empresses in the Forbidden City. But what stays with me the most is the silence of the halls that used to decide the fate of millions. Empty thrones, closed doors, and large courtyards tell stories that are more powerful than any exhibit label. The complex is still in great shape thanks to restoration work, but the Forbidden City is more than just protected. It has changed. It is a living museum, a national emblem, and a site where the memory of dictatorship is now used to teach people. The irony is not lost. A palace meant to keep people out has become one of the most popular sites on Earth. Even with all the tourists talking and taking pictures, the location still has a deeper meaning. You can feel it in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, where emperors used to stand over a court that was kneeling. You can sense it in the dark hallways of the inner court, where whispers changed lives. You can sense it in the gardens, where lonely monarchs used to walk among rock sculptures, wishing for a world they could scarcely touch. The Forbidden City is like a mirror for China in many ways. It shows off its beauty, power, weakness, and strength. It is not only a piece of history, it is a way to think about how the past affects the present. It has seen everything from isolation to revolt to public remembrance. It is still watching, but not as a seat of authority. It is now a witness to all that happened after the Empire's dying breath.